the subject of the discussion today, let me first of all congratulate the author of the book for what I think is a very interesting compilation, not just a compilation, an insight, perspective on aspects of our Constitution, which I think is very relevant today and provides us useful guidelines to how to evaluate the role of the Constitution, the relevance of the Constitution in our current times. So I'd like to congratulate Advocate Haridas for this book, and congratulate particularly because this is the third edition. Obviously, the book is doing well, and that is heartening. In fact, before I get into the substance of my talk, I think it's very important today for every citizen, particularly students, the millennial generation, to be aware of the Constitution, to be familiar with the Constitution, and to have a small book which is like the Constitution. In fact, I've carried one for reference. Something like this should probably be made compulsory or available to all students, at least at the high school or college level, because one can't overestimate the importance of what the Constitution means to us, particularly in these times when there is a threat to the Constitution, direct and indirect threats from different quarters. There are frontal attacks on the Constitution. There are insidious attempts to sabotage the Constitution. There is already a narrative that the Constitution needs to reflect the majoritarian view of the electorate or of a population or of a culture. So these are times which are perilous for Constitution, for our Constitution, and therefore for democracy. I think the sine qua non of a democracy, the litmus test of a democracy, the essential qualification of a democracy is a free media, a free press. Because elections do not necessarily determine or make democracy. Hitler was elected to power. So were several authoritarian figures, totalitarian figures in the past and today elected to power. Rule of law does not become the sine qua non or the essential attribute, shall we say, of a democracy. The rule of law can vary from country to country. There are countries where theft is punished by removing a limb. There are countries where capital punishment is given for what we would consider not such grave or exceptional situations. So, but a free press, a free, and I will add a free-wheeling press, is an essential attribute of democracy. If you must say democracy in one breath, you must be able to say a free media in the next breath. Otherwise, that democracy is a sham. I'm fairly convinced about this because I've thought about this for a long time and looked at situations, even around us. We have had a fairly free and free-wheeling press. But over the last few decades, that situation has deteriorated. As I speak now, in the 2022 World Press Freedom Index, which is audited every year by the Reporters Sans Frontier, which is an international body which looks at the level of the freedom of the press in different countries in the world. India's position has slipped to 150th position. The ranking is 150 among 180 countries. We have only about 30 countries below us. Most of them totalitarian regimes, banana republics, where there is no semblance of democracy, or where democracy is just tokenism. We are therefore in a very precarious situation from the index of the world of press freedom in terms of our democracy. The report of the Reporters Sans Frontier is damaging in several aspects. It calls the Indian media a colossus with clay feet. A colossus because we have a very powerful media. If you go by the characterization of media, even in the United States, where freedom of the press is protected, is constitutionally protected and sanctioned by the very first amendment of the Constitution, which says Congress shall make no laws which abolish the freedom of the press. We have similar media dispensation in many ways. Big media organizations, but in terms of their exercise of their freedoms, we find them very wanting. We have to look at how the free media in this country can be salvaged, and there's a direct relationship with that and the need to resuscitate, to revive, to re-establish the principles of the Constitution, the importance of the Constitution in our scheme of things. The Italian philosopher Umberto Eco explains the situation of the media because we often hear about the term reasonable restrictions. When you hear about the qualification of a right, more than the right itself, there is something wrong with our democracy. Article 19(1), A and G particularly, are the, shall we say, clauses in the Fundamental Rights chapter which enable, which empower press, the free press in this country. We talk of freedom of speech and expression, freedom to practice any profession. And Article 19(2), of course, talks about a number of reasonable restrictions. We increasingly hear about Article 19(2) and less about Article 19(1). So much so one would think that 19(1) is a dangerous proposition which needs to be checked constantly, invigilated, and contained by 19(2). In other words, the qualifications, the restrictions that 19(2) provide seem to gain precedence over the rights that 19(1) provide. A right, therefore, is literally undone or diminished or diffused by a qualification of that right. It's a bit like putting the cart before the horse. This is indicative of the mindset of our times, where restrictions, regulations become or gain precedence or priority over the rights. We are increasingly told that citizens should be aware of their duties more than their rights, or as much as their rights. As if there has been a situation where citizens exercising their rights have created a crisis of any kind in the political realm, the social realm, or in civil life or civic society. Therefore, Umberto Eco, as I was saying, the Italian philosopher, put this in perspective in terms of a paradox, if you like. He says in a democracy, as we all know, there's the separation of powers. You have the executive, the judiciary, the legislature. And then you have the fourth pillar of democracy, the fourth estate, which is the free media. And it says, while the executive, the legislature, and the democracy are accountable to the people institutionally or constitutionally. The executive is, as we know, the legislature is, you have to go back to the people every 5 years to come back, to be elected or to be rejected. Even the judiciary is, because notionally you can. And there have been instances in our case where we have initiated it. You can impeach a judge through 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament. We know that impeachment proceedings have been initiated, but not gone through because you don't want to drag the fair name of the judiciary, because it's such an important institution, into the mud. Whereas it is the fourth estate or the fourth pillar of democracy which is not so institutionally or constitutionally accountable. But he co-adds in the next breath, indeed, that is the way it should be. Because if the fourth pillar of democracy or the fourth estate is to be held institutionally or constitutionally accountable, like the other three estates, one of the other pillars have to supervise, implement, enforce that authority, and that press will therefore no longer be a free press. It will be what we call a kept press. It will be a press at the mercy of either the executive, the legislature, or the judiciary. I would add that the fourth estate or the fourth pillar of democracy, the spirit of the separation of powers in the Constitution, plays an important role in terms of the checks and balances, which is the essence of separation of powers. Just as the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary are supposed to have checks and balances, mutual checks and balances, the fourth estate or the fourth pillar of democracy, as an invigilator of democracy, as one who looks at the performance of these three arms of the government, must be considered a part of the schema of the separation of powers, and therefore must be accepted or considered a basic feature of our Constitution. The fourth estate, so although we do not have a prescribed right to freedom of the press in the Constitution, unlike, as I said, in the United States, the schema of things, because the role the fourth estate plays, the free press plays, in terms of checks and balances, vis-a-vis the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, it must be seen as playing an essential role and belonging to the idea of the basic feature doctrine of the Constitution, on which, of course, there have been judgments. You cannot change the basic feature of the Constitution. Even the legislature cannot legislate away the basic feature of a Constitution. Fundamental rights is, of course, core in that, among those rights. This is important. Because let us look at how did the separation of powers come about. It came about as a challenge to the idea that power is indivisible. Not so long ago, in the 18th century, or in the 17th century, 18th century actually, you would say, I am the state. King Louis XIV said, I am the state. After Louis the Deluge. It is at that time that Montesquieu comes up with the idea of the divisibility of powers. That you are not the state. That the state comprises the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. That is the origin of separation of powers. And the origin of it is actually a challenge to the idea of the indivisibility of power. And it is in that schema, because parallelly you have had the growth of journalism in the 17th century in England, through a series of struggles, through a series of landmark events, and these have been constitutive of the role of the press. Therefore, in the constitutional scheme of things, this constitutive empowerment and role of the press must be recognized as an essential attribute of the separation of powers. And therefore, I find it rather distressing when all the three arms of the government, of the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, bear down on the press, because the press is at the receiving end of all of them in some ways. You have contempt of court, which applied without mindlessly could become division intolerance. You have contempt of the House, which has been applied not just in the center but in the states. In Tamil Nadu, where I live, under the previous chief minister, there were hundreds of people who were issued, contempt of the House, legislature. And you have draconian laws which are executed by or implemented by the state, which are directed now, particularly over the recent time, against journalists. Whether it's a sedition law, which luckily has been put on freeze now recently, or UAPA, or any number of laws. These are apart from draconian acts of the center, heavy-handed attacks on the press. So this is the situation of the free press. And if I might remind you, as I said at the beginning, unless you continue to have a free press, you will not have a democracy. Because democracy will elect. Elections will elect someone to power. Particularly when you have to look at the idea of majoritarianism in a democracy. The role of a majority and a brute majority, the tyranny of majority, which are all issues today. The role of the press becomes that much more significant. Particularly when, just as Mushtaq mentioned about the role of technology, one of the attributes of technology has been that it has made the role of the press, the agency of the press, the representative role of the press, that much more difficult, because we have an expansion of the idea of the media. We have social media. And today you will find increasingly across the world, particularly authoritarian and autocratic governments or leaders, prefer not to engage with the press. Our Prime Minister hasn't given a press conference because he doesn't need to. He can talk to his constituency on Twitter, on Facebook, on Man Ki Baat, and the government channels as well as the social media, which makes the formal press, the fourth estate, redundant in some ways. So there's already a structural crisis, a structural dilemma because of technological advancement. However, social media, as Justice Mushtaq, I think, very relevantly pointed out, is largely dictated, run, harnessed by algorithmic functions. It's the algorithm which determines your appetite of what you want to do in social media, or what you will ask for in social media. So it determines both the demand and the supply. What I'm searching for in social media is unknown to myself, determined over a period of time by a particular line of vetting your appetite that the social media does. And therefore, these are machine, what you call ML, machine learning, artificial intelligence. These are all at work in the social media. Algorithms are strongly at work in the social media. You have this process of what you call air bubble filters or echo chambers. Increasingly, we belong to groups which believe and talk about the same things we believe in. Anybody who doesn't believe in what we believe in is an outsider. There's increasingly circulation of information. Our mental horizons are not expanding, they are contracting. So it's a fragmented, very fragmented, siloed kind of landscape that we are creating in the social media. And that is the constituency. That is the electorate. That is the vote bank, depending on how you look at it. And to stitch together majoritarian agendas in this scenario, the media becomes more an interference than an agent. And if that were not enough, a good section of the media, as I said at the beginning, is playing second fiddle to this process. Is actually complicit in this process. Is furthering this process of undoing the media itself. So we have a paradox where a section of the media is digging the media's own grave, without realizing the consequences, not just existential consequences for the media, but for the democracy that the media is supposed to further. Because what is the function of the media? To inform the citizens. Because an informed citizenry makes for a democracy, a better democracy, a more mature democracy. So these are the ways in which the media are tied up with the scheme of things as far as we are concerned. In terms of the Constitution itself, what is happening before us over the last several years is deliberate tensions are being created, even between the rights that the Constitution gives us. Take, for example, Justice Vaidhi Chandrachud, the father of the current judge in the Supreme Court, who was the post-emergency face in that background. He was the Chief Justice in the famous Minerva Mills versus Union of India case. Many of you all of you are lawyers who know this, which in fact was trying to undo the excesses of the emergency, Article 42 and so on. Where he says there are 3 articles in the Indian Constitution, which are the cornerstones of the Indian Constitution, which will determine the difference between making the Constitution, making India the future, the new future that Tagore dreamt about, or pulling it down to the abyss. And he said those 3 articles were Article 14, which talks about equality before law, Article 19, as we said, about freedom of speech and expression and so on, and Article 21, which is about right to life and personal liberty. You will find the tension, the contradictions that are set up among these. If I want to exercise my right under Article 14, equality before law, or my right under Article 19, freedom of speech or expression, it looks as if I have to forfeit my right under Article 21, freedom to life and personal liberty. As Gauri Lankesh and Davolkar and Pansare and many, many others realized. So this is the contradiction of the lived constitution in the Indian democratic context. So we have a crisis in terms of how do you draw your rights from the constitution without paying the consequences for that. Courts do come in. Courts, in fact, are the only silver lining, shall we say, in this scenario. But it is post facto. It's often post facto. And by then a life is lost, the damage is done, the cost is paid, the heavy price is paid. And therefore, we need to look at how we can think of re-establishing the Constitution in a lived sense. How can it become important for the average citizen, for the common citizen? The idea of democracy was not the idea of majority in the original sense of the term. Aristotle, in the origin of, you look at the term democracy, democracy was ruled by the poor. That was democracy, the Aristotelian tradition. And oligarchy was ruled by the rich. Period. Aristotle said there are only 2 forms of government. Aristocracy, which actually deteriorated to oligarchy, and democracy, which is ruled by the poor. So, less only has as much right as any citizen. And it's only a question of interpretation. But society, courts have consistently given the press moral high ground and treated the press as important for democracy because they've seen them as inalienable, the connection between democracy and the press as an inalienable kind of connection. However, part of the responsibility and the problem lies in the press itself. We know that perhaps since the 1990s, the heritage of the press in India was a very different heritage. It was a very different legacy. It was a legacy of struggle for independence movement. In fact, if you look at the leaders of the independence movement, almost without exception, they will be either lawyers or journalists or both, from Mahatma Gandhi on to everybody else. It was seen as an important weapon. You weaponized the press against colonial ruler. You weaponized words, you weaponized articles, you weaponized speeches, your right to freedom of speech and expression against the colonial ruler. And today, when you try to do that, you become anti-national. I think it was Ali Nariman who said that in India, you have freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom after speech. In fact, it's a little worse now. You don't have freedom of speech, but you have freedom of hate speech. You can go out there and in the most vicious, antisocial, dangerous language, castigate a minority community or religion, and even get away without an FIR being filed against you. You draw a cartoon, write a poem about someone in the executive, about the Prime Minister, or about somebody, and you'll be hauled up. On what? On sedition charges, perhaps. This is how high-handed and arbitrary and pathetically the rule of law is being enforced in this country. In fact, hate speech and the enforcement of law is another paradox. You'll find that those who need to enforce the law, the police, that's when they're alive to the right of the person to speak. It's almost as if they are saying, like the French philosopher, I don't agree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. The police is saying to the man, probably who's uttering this hate speech. So these are the ways in which you're standing the constitutional schema, the rights that are endowed to you under the Constitution on its head. And we seem to be helpless observers, participants, or victims in this process. That is a crisis, and if that is not a crisis, I don't know what it is of Indian democracy. And therefore, I think as Justice Riley Chandrachud said, if you want to see an India which as Tagore dreamt, where the mind is without, the prescience of Tagore. He wrote that poem, in fact, several decades before independence, perhaps in the late 20s or 1930s, where he said, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where words come out in the depth of truth, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habits, where the mind is led forward into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. It is the anthem of our times. It's not a poem, it's an anthem of our times. Every word, every line in that poem is what we are living through, what we are realizing, and what we are fighting for, unknown to ourselves. So we are, I think, in a stage where what we take for granted is not there. We may be in denial about it. We may pretend we are exaggerating the problems, but the fact of the matter is, it is not there. As I think hundreds and thousands of ordinary citizens are experiencing. 13,000 people were in jail on sedition charges. Now, of course, they may have recourse. Some 500 odd cases over the last 5 years or 10 years alone. These are stunning statistics. AIDEM, an organization which audits democracies across the world, the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, has characterized India as an elected autocracy. in its last report. Before that, Freedom House has called India a lesser democracy. So we are already becoming a suspect democratic entity in the community of nations. But we flagrantly refuse to accept this. We flagrantly say that these are all vested interests, motivated charges. When the WHO says 40 lakh Indians have died of COVID, not 4.8 lakhs as per the domestic statistic, we say no, that's not true. Now, WHO assumably is a specialized agency which looks at that. Either you provide proof that it's not true, but you're saying it's not true, it doesn't become untrue. So, we are living in a very, very difficult and dangerous post-truth phase in some ways, but a post-truth phase which is recognizable as proto-fascist as well. Because these are symptomatic of the move from an authoritarian system into a totalitarian system. We have known autocracies before. In the 1970s, we have faced emergency, which was a formal declared emergency, and we know what a dark chapter it was in Indian democratic history. But we thought that was a lesson. We thought we were chastened by the experience. We thought we would never cross that bridge again. But here we are before another bridge, which is far worse in many ways, because it is not a declared emergency, it's an undeclared emergency. It's therefore that much more insidious, that much more dangerous, that much more stealthy. And it takes a lot of effort to understand what is going on. That's the danger, because so the shift from authoritarianism into totalitarianism is, as I see it, the phase we are in. These are two distinct ideas. One shouldn't confuse authoritarianism with totalitarianism, because totalitarianism is when you marshal or leverage all aspects of society, the capillaries of the entire political system, to promote your agenda. That is happening. So what are the forces at work today? There is the formal force of the executive and the attacks by the state on the people. Attacks by the state on the people, when the state says the attack is on the state. Imagine being able to convince a population that 80% of our population is in danger by 20% of the population. This is the narrative. This was the narrative in elections in UP and other places. This was the narrative a good section of the media promoted as well. I mean, even a child would understand, will find the logic astounding. So these are the ways in which a new kind of agenda setting, it's a long-term agenda, there's no doubt about that, is being pursued. Nietzsche famously said, because he had a good understanding of fascism, of particularly the Hitlerian mode, he said the history of truth is the history of the longest lasting lie. Because if you repeat a lie 100,000 times, it becomes a truth. Nobody is wiser. That is really the post-truth in some ways. Trump did it in a glib manner. He said 1.5 million people turned up for his inauguration when he became president. Television is covering it live. Hundreds of cameras are covering it live, and you know that the crowd is not more than a few hundred. But he said, no, they're all lying. It's all fake news. 1.5 million people turned up at my inauguration. How do you gainsay that? How do you argue with that? What you see is not what you believe. What you hear, what you're told to believe is what you should believe. So the history of truth is the history of the longest lasting lie. The problem is, those who need to point this out sharply either don't or resort to silence. In America, they don't. I think American press is fairly acquitted itself rather well, although there is a polarization there between the Fox News kind of rightist press and the rest. In India, unfortunately, a good part of the mainstream press resorts to the expediency of silence. And that, I think, is as criminal as being complicit. Yevtushenko famously said, when truth is replaced by silence, that silence is a lie. We need to examine ourselves. We need to put ourselves in the dock, the media, the formal media, to ask ourselves whether by ignoring, by pretending we are not seeing these very manifest trends before us and not talking about it, by not informing our citizens about it, are we diplomatically salvaging our own conscience? Or are we becoming liars? Are we becoming part of a flank, shall we say, in this whole concerted attack on democracy? So I conclude by saying that we have two challenges before us. The frontal attack on the media, the frontal attack, of course, on the Constitution and creating these tensions in the Constitution, making the Constitution irrelevant or redundant, or pitting the Constitution against the myth of an age-old culture, age-old practice of tradition, of convention, and saying the Constitution needs to revise itself to reflect that whole tradition and lineage and holy culture, which of course literally means we need to go back, we need to retrogress, not progress. And the role of the press, the importance of the press. The press has a credibility crisis at a time when the press is so important. The role of the press has become inevitable. The role of the press has become urgent. The role of freedom of the press, a responsible free press, is today far more important than ever before in my living memory. But that unfortunately is also a time when we should make sure that the fourth estate does not become a cat's paw of the government. It does not become the excuse for putting our democracy and our constitution in crisis. Thank you very much.